Diane Farrow walked onto my property at 8:17 on a Saturday morning, pulled up a fistful of my native plantings with her bare hands, and posted the photos to the neighborhood Facebook group before I had finished my first cup of coffee. She was smiling in every single one of them. She had no idea what she'd just touched. I watched from the back porch, didn't go outside, didn't say a word, just stood there with my mug while she and Chad Hollister and two other board members worked their way down my fence line, yanking up plants they clearly couldn't name, photographing everything like they were filing evidence in a case they'd already won. They were filing evidence, just not the kind they thought. Here's the thing about people who've never been checked. They move fast, they move loud, and they leave a trail wide enough to drive a county inspector's truck through. Diane had the HOA chairmanship, Chad had the connections, and between the two of them, they had about 30 combined years of getting away with exactly this kind of thing. What they didn't have was any idea that the man standing quietly on that back porch had spent his entire career learning exactly how systems like theirs collapse from the inside. I let them finish. I even let Chad give a little thumbs up to the camera. Then I went inside, pulled up the county environmental office number, and made a call I'd been ready to make for 11 days. When someone hands you their confession in broad daylight and calls it a victory, do you correct them, or do you let them sign it first? My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 54 years old, retired civil engineer, 3 years with the City of Austin Infrastructure Division. I read municipal code the way other people read the news. First thing in the morning, with coffee, looking for anything that didn't line up. That's not a personality quirk. That's a survival skill, developed over 3 decades of watching projects get killed, budgets get raided, and good work get buried because somebody didn't read the right clause on the right page of the right document. In my field, the people who lasted were not the loudest or the most aggressive. They were the ones who understood that every system, zoning, permitting, environmental, HOA, has an internal logic, and that logic cuts both ways. It protects the people who built the system, and it absolutely destroys the people who abuse it carelessly. I retired 14 months ago. Bought this house in Lakewood Ranch specifically for the lot. 180-foot southern exposure, good soil, enough room to do something I'd wanted to do for years. Restore a genuine native plant habitat along the property line. Virginia creeper, cedar elm, wild Mustang grape, the kind of layered, living boundary that takes 2 seasons to establish and another decade to fully come into itself. I am not a confrontational person by nature. My neighbors on the north side, the Pattersons, we've shared a fence for 3 years and exchanged maybe 40 words total, most of them about the weather, and I consider that a successful neighborly relationship. I don't play music loud. I don't park on the street. I show up to HOA meetings maybe twice a year, sit in the back, and leave when the agenda is done. What I do, quietly and consistently, is pay attention. I notice when things don't match, when the cited rule doesn't say what someone claims it says, when the approval granted to one property couldn't legally have been granted given the guidelines on record, when a violation notice references a standard that doesn't appear anywhere in the actual CC and Rs. These aren't things I go looking for, they're things I can't stop seeing, the way a carpenter can't stop noticing when a door frame is half a degree off plumb. Chad Hollister's 6-foot white vinyl privacy wall went up in April. Instant approval, no conditions, no aesthetic review. Mine, cedar, traditional post and rail, actually consistent with the original neighborhood design guidelines, was rejected in June, with a letter so vague it barely qualified as a sentence. I noted the discrepancy, filed it, said nothing. That's usually how it starts with me. Not with anger, with a folder. I have a rule I developed somewhere around year 12 of my career after watching a senior engineer blow up a 14-month project over a billing dispute that could have been resolved with one certified letter and a little patience. The rule is this: never use a large response for a small provocation. Not because it's noble, because it's wasteful. When you overreact early, you spend your credibility, you reveal your hand, and you give the other side exactly the narrative they need. That you're the difficult one, the unreasonable one, the one who can't be dealt with. I've seen it happen to good people dozens of times. They were right about the underlying problem and completely wrong about the timing, and the timing is what destroyed them. The corollary to that rule is equally important. Never let a pattern go unnamed just because each individual incident seems small. 1 questionable approval is a judgment call. 2 is a coincidence worth watching. 3 is a system, and a system can be documented, mapped, and presented in a format that no reasonable board, attorney, or county official can dismiss. What Diane Farrell had been running in Lakewood Ranch was a system. I didn't know its full shape yet in June when my fence permit came back rejected, but I knew the smell of it. I'd encountered it before in municipal work. The selective enforcement, the vague language designed to give maximum discretion to whoever held the pen, the approvals that flowed smoothly toward friends, and the violations that materialized mysteriously for anyone who asked too many questions. Power like that depends on one thing above everything else: the assumption that nobody is keeping score. Most people aren't. Most people get a violation notice, feel the flush of indignation, argue about it at the next meeting, and then go home and quietly comply because the cost of fighting is higher than the cost of surrender. Diane had been operating in that environment long enough that she'd stopped even being careful. She sent vague rejection letters. She issued violations with no cited basis. She approved Chad's vinyl monstrosity on a verbal nod and apparently kept no paperwork trail worth examining. That's what happens when a system goes unchecked for too long. It gets sloppy. It starts leaving fingerprints everywhere because it no longer believes anyone is looking. I was looking. I'd been looking since April, when I first pulled Chad's approval documentation through a public records request and found 3 separate guideline violations the board had simply chosen not to apply. I said nothing about it at the time. I just added it to the folder and waited to see what came next. What came next was my fence rejection, then my appeal denial, then a violation notice about my native plantings. Each one a gift, each one carefully filed. Does a person have to be malicious to deserve consequences? Or does it matter more that they were warned and kept going anyway? Let me tell you what was actually at stake here, because fence permit dispute makes it sound like a suburban squabble over aesthetics. It wasn't. Chad Hollister's property sits directly to my east. His floodlights, 3 of them, mounted high on the eave facing my yard, ran every night until midnight on a motion sensor so sensitive it triggered when the wind moved the branches of his oak tree. I documented 43 separate activation events in a single 2-week period, 43 nights of white light flooding my bedroom window at 11 p.m., while Chad slept soundly on the far side of his vinyl wall. His golden retriever, a large, cheerful, completely undisciplined animal named Biscuit, had treated my raised herb beds as a personal bathroom for the better part of 2 years. I had rebuilt the rosemary bed 3 times. The parsley didn't survive the 2nd season. I'd spoken to Chad about it twice, politely, and both times he'd nodded and said he'd look into an invisible fence. Biscuit remained uncontained. The herb beds remained a target. His 2 teenage sons used the gap in my back hedge as a cut-through to the greenway trail behind the neighborhood. Daily, sometimes with friends, sometimes with bikes. I'd filled the gap with a trellis in March. They pushed it aside. I re-anchored it with stakes in April. One of the stakes disappeared. The cedar fence I'd designed wasn't decorative. It was a measured, necessary boundary between my property and a sustained, low-grade erosion of everything I'd built on it. 6 feet of traditional post and rail cedar, stained to match the original neighborhood palette, positioned precisely along the legal property line. I'd had it professionally drawn. I'd verified every setback measurement against the county survey on file. It was, by any reasonable reading of the guidelines, approvable on a Tuesday afternoon without a second look. Instead, I got a rejection letter with no citations, an appeal denial with no explanation, and 11 days later, a violation notice about plants I'd spent 2 seasons establishing along the same property line where the fence was supposed to go. They weren't trying to enforce standards, they were trying to make me give up. I want to be clear about something. I do not give up. Not when I'm right. and not when I have documentation. The violation notice about my native plantings arrived on a Tuesday, 30 days to replace everything with standard turf grass or face $200 per day in fines. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, slowly, the way I used to read a contractor's submitted specs when something in the first pass didn't sit right. The notice cited community aesthetic standards and referenced a section of the CC&Rs that, when I pulled up the actual document, said nothing about native planting specifically. It mentioned maintained landscaping and consistent neighborhood appearance, language vague enough to mean almost anything, which is precisely why it had been written that way. Maximum discretion for whoever held the pen. I'd seen that drafting technique before. It's not accidental. It's architectural. But here's what caught my attention more than the citation itself: the timing. My appeal had been denied 8 days earlier. No explanation, no board discussion on record, no response to the 17 pages of precedent documentation I'd submitted. Just a single sentence: appeal denied. And then, 11 days after that denial, a violation notice materialized for plantings that had been sitting along that fence line for 2 full seasons without a single prior complaint. I sat with that sequence for a while. One rejected permit could be a judgment call. One denied appeal could be a procedural decision I disagreed with. But a violation notice appearing 11 days after a denied appeal, targeting plantings that had existed unremarked for 22 months, citing language too vague to be enforceable. That wasn't enforcement. That was pressure. Specifically calibrated pressure, designed to cost me time and money until I decided the fence wasn't worth it. That was the moment I stopped seeing isolated incidents and started seeing a pattern with a shape. I went back through my records. Chad's vinyl wall approval, granted in 4 days, no conditions, no aesthetic review documentation on file. My cedar fence rejection, issued in 11 days, no cited guideline, no comparison to existing approved structures. My appeal, denied without discussion or recorded vote in the board minutes I'd already obtained through a public records request. And now this. 4 data points, same hand, same direction, same beneficiary. I opened a new folder on my desktop and labeled it with the date. Then I started a second document, a timeline, minute by minute, with sources cited for every entry. Not because I was planning anything yet, because, in my experience, the moment you recognize a pattern is exactly when you need to start building the record that proves it existed before you acted on it. I also, that same evening, pulled up the Texas Administrative Code and spent 2 hours reading a section I'd last reviewed during an infrastructure corridor project 6 years earlier. Native plant restoration permits, state-level protections, HOA override provisions. I read it carefully. Then I read it again. Have you ever watched someone build a trap around themselves, one decision at a time, completely convinced they were building a wall? I could have filed the restoration permit immediately. The Tuesday I received the violation notice, I had enough to move. The research was done, the precedent was clear, and the county environmental office had a straightforward application process I could have completed in an afternoon. I didn't. Instead, I drove to Diane Farrell's house at 6:30 that evening, knocked once. She answered in reading glasses with a glass of white wine, the particular expression of someone who expected either a delivery driver or nobody. I kept it short. I told her I'd received the violation notice. I told her I found the timing unusual given the age of the plantings and the proximity to my denied appeal. I told her I wanted to give the board an opportunity to revisit the matter before I pursued other remedies, because, in my experience, these things tended to get more complicated and more expensive for everyone involved once outside parties entered the picture. She looked at me for a moment over the top of her glasses. Then she told me the board's decisions were final, that the plantings clearly violated community standards, and that if I had concerns about the process, I was welcome to submit another written appeal. I nodded. I thanked her for her time. I told her I hoped she'd reconsider. She closed the door while I was still on the step. I walked back to my car, noted the time, 6:47 p.m., and wrote down the substance of the conversation in the Notes app on my phone before I'd pulled out of her street. Not because I thought it would become evidence, because I'd learned long ago that the discipline of documenting everything, even things that seem minor, is what separates people who can prove what happened from people who can only describe it. What I felt on that drive home was not anger. I want to be precise about that. It was something quieter and more useful, a kind of settling, the way a large decision feels once you've stopped deliberating and simply made it. Diane had been given the off-ramp. She'd seen it clearly, assessed it, and chosen to accelerate instead. That choice belonged entirely to her. So did everything that followed from it. I filed the restoration permit application the next morning at 8 a.m. I listed every species already established along the fence line. I attached the 2-season photo documentation I'd been keeping since installation. I included the county soil assessment from my original landscaping plan. I also, in the notes section of the application, flagged that the site was currently subject to an active HOA violation notice and asked the county to note that flag in the permit record. I wanted a timestamp on the sequence. I wanted it official. I wanted it to be absolutely clear later which came first. If you give someone the chance to stop and they choose not to, at what point does their outcome stop being bad luck and start being a decision they made? The permit came back approved on a Friday afternoon. 4 days. Faster than I expected, though the county inspector I'd spoken with on the phone had been unambiguous about the application's strength. This is exactly what the restoration program was designed for, she'd said. Indigenous barrier plantings along a residential property line. Professionally installed, properly documented, 2 seasons established. She paused. And you said there's an active HOA violation notice on these plantings? I confirmed there was. I'll note that in the file, she said. There was a particular flatness in her voice that I recognized from years of working with inspectors, the tone of someone who has seen this specific situation before and already knows how it ends. The permit approval carried full state environmental protection status. The language was unambiguous. The permitted restoration site was protected against interference from any party, including homeowners associations, pending a formal county review process that required documented ecological justification to initiate and took a minimum of 90 days. I printed 2 copies, filed one, laminated the other, and posted it inside a weatherproof document sleeve at the northern corner of the planting bed, facing the street, clearly visible from the sidewalk. Then I waited. What I was watching for was simple. Diane now had 3 options. She could rescind the violation notice, acknowledging that the permit superseded her authority. She could contact the county to initiate a formal challenge, a process that would require documented grounds, a 90-day review window, and the kind of paper trail that invites scrutiny. Or she could ignore the permit entirely and proceed as though it didn't exist. I had a very clear sense of which option she would choose. People who've operated unchecked for a long time have a particular relationship with paperwork they didn't generate themselves. They tend to treat it as an obstacle to be dismissed rather than a boundary to be respected. They assume that confidence and authority and the social weight of their position will carry them past technical details that they haven't bothered to understand. I posted the permit on a Monday. By Thursday, Diane had not contacted the county. By the following Saturday, she'd organized a cleanup crew. The Friday the permit was approved, I made 3 calls. The first was to my security camera provider. I had 2 exterior cameras already, one covering the driveway, one covering the back porch. I added a third, mounted at the northwest corner of the house, angled to cover the entire 180-foot fence line at ground level. Wide angle, 4K resolution, motion activated with continuous 30-second pre-capture, meaning it recorded the 30 seconds before any motion event triggered it. I'd used the same setup at a job site years ago after a contractor dispute. It is, in my experience, the single most useful piece of documentation equipment available to a private citizen. The installer came Saturday morning. By noon, every inch of the planting bed was covered from 2 angles with timestamp overlay active. The second call was to the county environmental office. I asked them to confirm in writing the protection status of the permitted site and the specific legal consequences of unauthorized interference with a permitted native habitat restoration. The response came by email Monday morning. 2 paragraphs signed by the district environmental officer, clear and unambiguous. Destruction of permitted native habitat. Class B environmental violation. Minimum fine structure starting at $4,000 per incident, escalating with documented willfulness. Potential civil liability to the permit holder for restoration costs. I printed that email, added it to the folder. The third call was to my neighbor on the south side. Patricia Okafor, a retired school teacher who had lived in Lakewood Ranch for 11 years and had, in that time, developed a comprehensive and meticulously sourced opinion of Diane Farrell's board tenure. Patricia had received 2 violation notices in the past 18 months. She had paid both fines without appeal because, as she told me, she didn't think anyone would listen. I asked Patricia if she still had the notices and any correspondence related to them. She had everything, filed by date in a manila folder she kept in her home office because, she said, something had always told her she might need it. I told her I thought she might need it soon and that I'd be in touch. I did not tell her what I was expecting to happen. I didn't need to. I just needed to know where the documentation was and that it was intact. By the time Diane organized her Saturday cleanup crew, I had timestamps on everything. Camera coverage on everything, a written legal opinion from a county official on everything, and a neighbor with her own folder, waiting. The stage was set. I had not built it for them. They had built it themselves. I had simply declined to take it apart. They arrived at 8:14 a.m., 6 people. Diane in a wide-brimmed sun hat and canvas gardening gloves, Chad in a Lakewood Ranch HOA polo shirt, the navy blue ones the board had apparently commissioned at community expense, a detail I noted for later. 2 board members I recognized from the annual meeting, 2 neighbors I didn't recognize at all, people who had clearly been told they were volunteering for a routine community cleanup and had no reason to think otherwise. I was on the back porch with coffee before any of them reached the fence line. I watched the camera feed on my phone. The Northwest unit picked them up the moment they came through the side gate, which, I noted, they opened without knocking, without calling ahead, without any attempt to notify me they were entering my property. The timestamp read 8:14:23. Diane walked the length of the planting bed first, hands on her hips, the posture of someone conducting an inspection of something that already belonged to her. She stopped at the weatherproof sleeve where the permit was posted, glanced at it, and kept walking. She saw it. I have that on camera. The timestamp is 8:16:07. She stood in front of that document sleeve for 11 seconds, close enough to read it, and then turned away and picked up a pair of pruning shears from the bag Chad had set down in my grass. 11 seconds. Then she started pulling. Within 20 minutes, they had cleared a 15-foot section of the bed. Virginia creeper, cedar elm seedlings, wild Mustang grape, piled in a heap at the edge of my lawn. 2 of them had their phones out, photographing the cleared section with the satisfied energy of people documenting a job well done. One of the unrecognized neighbors, a woman in a green fleece, genuinely well-meaning, I could tell by the way she worked, held up a handful of pulled vines and asked Diane if she should bag them or leave them for pickup. "Leave them," Diane said. "I want Marcus to see what we did." I noted the time. I noted the quote. I went inside and called the county environmental office. The voicemail timestamp on that call is 8:47 a.m. By noon, the Facebook post was up. Diane had written it herself. I know because the prose style matched her board meeting communications exactly. That particular blend of bureaucratic authority and performative warmth that people develop after too many years of running meetings where nobody pushes back. The post read, in its entirety, "Great morning in Lakewood Ranch. A volunteer crew cleared dangerous invasive species from along the Webb property fence line today, restoring the area to community standards. Thank you to Chad, Linda, Robert, and our wonderful neighbors for giving up a Saturday morning to keep our neighborhood beautiful. This is what community looks like. 3 photos attached, before, during, and after. timestamps visible in the photo metadata for anyone who knew to look. Diane's face in two of them, smiling, pruning shears in hand, standing in the middle of my permitted restoration site. 41 people liked it within the first 2 hours. 7 left comments. 1 asked what kind of invasive species had been removed. Diane replied, "A thick tangle of wild vines and weeds that had been cited for violation. Glad we could help get it sorted." I read every word of that thread. Then I screenshotted the entire post, the comments, the timestamps, and Diane's replies. I saved the screenshots to the folder. I also used a web archiving tool to capture a permanent record of the page as it existed at 12:34 p.m. that Saturday, in case the post was later edited or deleted. Then I went back inside and made lunch. Here is what Diane had accomplished with that post, without realizing it. She had created a public, time-stamped photographic confession that she and identifiable members of the HOA board had entered my property without notice, had observed the posted county permit, and had proceeded to destroy a permitted environmental restoration site anyway. She had named the participants. She had described the action in her own words. She had published it voluntarily to a neighborhood audience of several hundred people. She had done this, apparently, because she wanted credit for it. I've thought about that a lot since. The particular confidence required to publicize your own trespass. The absolute certainty that the audience will see what you want them to see, that nobody in that comment thread will know enough to understand what you've actually just described. It is, in my professional experience, the most dangerous kind of mistake. Not the ones people try to hide, the ones they're proud of. What does it cost a person to be so certain of their own authority that they stop checking whether it actually applies? What I hadn't anticipated, and I want to be honest about this, was how quickly the board would formalize what had started as a Saturday morning cleanup into something with institutional weight behind it. By Monday, Diane had sent a follow-up communication to all Lakewood Ranch homeowners via the official HOA email list. The subject line read, "Update, Community Standards Enforcement Action, Web Property." The body of the email described the Saturday cleanup as an authorized board-directed remediation, referenced the outstanding violation notice by file number, and stated that the board had exercised its maintenance authority under Section 7.4 of the CC&Rs to restore the property boundary to community standards. Section 7.4. I pulled it up immediately. Section 7.4 gave the board authority to perform maintenance on common areas when a homeowner failed to remedy a cited violation within the notice period. My 30-day notice period had not expired. The cleanup had occurred 11 days after the violation notice was issued, and my property was not, by any definition in the CC&Rs or in Texas property law, a common area. She had cited the wrong section, applied it to the wrong property, used it before the notice period had elapsed. 3 separate procedural violations in a single sentence sent to every homeowner in the community under the official HOA letterhead, with her signature at the bottom. I printed the email, added it to the folder. The folder now had a second section, but Diane wasn't finished. 2 days later, a contractor's truck appeared at the edge of my property. A landscaping company I didn't recognize. 2 workers with sod rolls in the truck bed, apparently there to begin replacing my native plantings with turf grass, as the violation notice had demanded. I walked out to the street and asked them who had hired them. They showed me a work order. It was on HOA letterhead. It listed my address. It was signed by Diane Farrell in her capacity as board president, authorizing the landscaping company to complete remediation work on the cited property and billing the cost to the HOA maintenance fund. She had hired a contractor with HOA funds to perform work on my private property without my consent, without a court order, and 11 days before my violation notice period had even expired. I photographed the work order. I photographed the truck. I photographed the workers, the sod rolls, and the street address clearly visible on my mailbox in the same frame. I asked the workers politely to wait while I made a phone call. I called the county environmental office first. The officer I reached confirmed that any landscaping work on a permitted restoration site without county authorization would constitute an additional violation, that the contractor could be held jointly liable, and that she was formally recommending the workers not proceed. I relayed that information to the crew. They called their supervisor. Their supervisor called Diane. The truck sat at the curb for 40 minutes while that conversation happened. Then they left without unloading a single roll of sod. I called Patricia Okafor that evening and told her to expect something to happen soon. I didn't tell her what, I just told her to keep her folder close. I also, that night, sent a single email to Diane Farrell. 6 words: "You should stop here. I'm serious." She did not reply. How many times does a system have to ignore its own rules before the people inside it stop believing the rules apply to them at all? There was a man named Robert Tillman on that Saturday cleanup crew. I'd placed him as a board member from the annual meeting. Treasurer, I thought, though I hadn't been certain until I pulled the HOA's publicly filed officer roster the following Monday and confirmed it. Robert Tillman, Treasurer, Lakewood Ranch HOA, appointed 18 months prior. I'd watched him on the camera feed. He'd worked the southern end of the planting bed, pulling methodically, not photographing anything, not talking much. At one point, he'd stopped, crouched down, and looked at something close to the ground for a long moment. Then he'd stood up, taken 2 steps back, and called out to Diane. I couldn't hear what he said, but I could read the exchange clearly enough from the body language. He pointed at something in the bed. Diane walked over, looked, said something brief. Robert said something back. Diane shook her head and made a dismissive gesture with the pruning shears. Robert went back to work. I didn't know what he'd seen. I had a reasonable hypothesis, but I didn't know. What I did know was that he had flagged something. Diane had dismissed it, and he had complied anyway. I thought about that exchange more than once in the days that followed. There's a particular kind of person in every organization who knows, on some level, that something is wrong, who sees the tell, registers the discomfort, raises it once, and then, when they're waved off by the person with more authority, puts their head down and keeps working. They're not malicious. They're not stupid. They're just not willing to pay the cost of being the one who makes it a bigger problem than it already is. Robert Tillman was that person. I didn't resent him for it. I'd worked with 100 versions of him over 30 years. Good people, mostly. Institutional people. People who had learned that the path of least resistance ran directly through the decision to look away. What I noted, professionally, was that his discomfort was itself a data point. It meant someone on that crew had seen something worth pausing over and had been overruled. When the time came, and I was now certain it was coming, Robert Tillman's body language on that camera footage was going to tell a story that no attorney would want to try to argue around. I flagged the timestamp, added a note to the folder. Then I waited for Sunday evening. The 30-day violation window closed in 18 days. That was the deadline I was working against. Not because I was afraid of the fines, but because once the notice period expired, Diane would have procedural grounds to escalate. She could authorize another contractor visit with slightly more legal cover. She could begin formally accruing the $200 daily fines and liening the property. She could take the matter to a collections process that, even if I ultimately won, would cost me months of paperwork and several $1,000s in legal fees to unwind. I needed the county environmental complaint formally processed and the violation notice officially invalidated before that window closed. The problem was pace. County environmental complaints move on county time, not mine. I had filed the habitat destruction report the morning of the cleanup. I had submitted the camera footage, the Facebook post screenshots, the archived web page, the work order photograph, and the county permit approval as supporting documentation. The environmental officer had acknowledged receipt and confirmed the complaint was active, but active did not mean resolved, and resolved did not mean fast. I called the environmental office on Wednesday. The officer I'd been working with was in the field. I left a message. Thursday, I reached her directly and asked about timeline. She told me the complaint had been assigned to an investigator, that the documentation package I'd submitted was strong, and that she expected a formal determination within 2 weeks. 2 weeks was tight. Not impossible, but tight. That same Thursday, a second violation notice appeared on my door. This one cited the incomplete remediation of the original planting violation. In other words, the fact that I hadn't removed the remaining plants after the partial cleanup and reset the fine clock. $200 per day, starting immediately for continued non-compliance. I stood on my porch and read it twice. Diane was accelerating. She knew, on some level, that something was in motion. My 6-word email had told her that much, and her response to uncertainty was to press harder and faster, to bury me in process before I could get traction. It was the same instinct that had driven every prior escalation, not strategy, reflex. The reflex of someone who had always won by moving faster than the other person could respond. What she didn't know was that I had already responded 11 days ago, before the cleanup, before the contractor, before either violation notice. I called Patricia Okafor that evening and asked if she would be willing to provide a written statement about her own violation history for submission to the county investigator as evidence of a pattern of selective enforcement. She said yes before I finished the sentence. I called the environmental office first thing Friday morning and added Patricia's statement to the complaint file. Then I sat down and wrote a letter to the HOA's insurance carrier. When the clock is running against you and the other side thinks they're winning, is that the worst moment, or is that exactly when the trap closes? The letter to the HOA's insurance carrier was 2 pages, single-spaced, no emotional language, no accusations, no demands, just a precise chronological account of events, with every claim sourced to a specific document, timestamp, or camera record. I described the fence permit rejection and the lack of cited guidelines. I described Chad's vinyl wall approval and the 3 guideline violations the board had chosen not to apply. I described the appeal denial with no recorded vote. I described the violation notice, the timeline discrepancy, and the vague statutory basis. I described my visit to Diane, the conversation, and the time I noted on my phone afterward. I described the permit approval, the posted notice, and the 11-second camera record of Diane reading it before proceeding. I described the cleanup, the Facebook post, the community email citing the wrong CC&R section against the wrong property type before the notice period had elapsed. I described the contractor visit, the HOA-funded work order, and the workers who left without unloading. Then I described Patricia Okafor, her 2 violation notices, the fines she had paid, the dates, the amounts, the absence of any corresponding action against comparable properties owned by board members or their associates. I attached everything, 41 pages of supporting documentation. Insurance carriers for homeowners associations are not neutral parties. They are risk assessment organizations, and what I had sent them was a carefully organized portrait of an HOA board operating so far outside its legal authority that any competent underwriter would immediately begin calculating exposure. Unauthorized entry onto private property, destruction of a state-permitted environmental restoration site, misapplication of CC&R enforcement authority, use of HOA funds for work on private property without court authorization, a pattern of selective enforcement documented across multiple homeowners. Each one of those items, individually, represented potential liability. Together, they represented the kind of claim profile that triggers a coverage review, a formal letter to the insured, and, in my experience with municipal insurance disputes, a very uncomfortable conversation between the carrier's legal team and whoever signed the work orders. I sent the letter certified mail on a Friday. The insurance carrier's response arrived 11 days later. Formal letterhead, 3 paragraphs. The carrier was conducting a review of recent board actions and was formally recommending that the board seek independent legal counsel before taking any further enforcement actions related to the Webb property or any other currently disputed matters. I read that letter standing at my mailbox. Then I walked inside, added it to the folder, and allowed myself, for the first time since June, something close to a full breath. But here is the piece that completed the picture. The piece I hadn't built and hadn't anticipated and couldn't have engineered if I'd tried. Chad's wife posted on the neighborhood Facebook group that Sunday evening. A long post, asking for home remedy recommendations. She described the rash in detail, the blistering, the swelling, the particular progression of the reaction. She mentioned that Chad's hands had swollen badly enough that he'd missed 2 days of work. She mentioned that Diane had been to urgent care. She mentioned, with the particular exasperation of someone who has been dealing with a household medical situation for 4 days and needs to talk about it, exactly which plants they'd been pulling, exactly where, and exactly when. Timestamps, names, location. A precise botanical description of the affected plants, written by someone who had no idea what she was describing. It was, in 30 years of documentation work, the single most complete unsolicited confession I had ever encountered. Have you ever watched someone hand you the exact piece you needed, at the exact moment you needed it, because they simply couldn't stop themselves from talking? The emergency board meeting was called for a Tuesday evening, 12 days after the cleanup. I was not invited. That's not unusual. HOA board meetings in Texas are not required to be open to general membership unless the agenda includes a vote on assessments or rule changes. This was listed as an internal administrative matter. I found out about it through Patricia, who had received the same generic meeting notice sent to all homeowners and had called me the moment it arrived. I went anyway. Sat in my car across the street from the community center with a thermos of coffee and watched the parking lot fill up. Diane's silver sedan, Chad's truck, Robert Tillman's Subaru. 2 other vehicles I recognized from board meetings, and one I didn't recognize. A dark blue sedan that had arrived first and parked closest to the entrance, which I photographed on the chance it turned out to be relevant. It turned out to be relevant. What I learned afterward through Patricia, who had a friend on the meeting's administrative staff, was that the unknown sedan belonged to an attorney the board had retained on an emergency basis following the insurance carrier's letter. The attorney had reviewed the documentation the carrier had flagged. He had then spent approximately 40 minutes explaining to the board, in terms that Patricia's contact described as not gentle, the precise legal exposure created by the sequence of events since the cleanup. The trespass, the permit violation, the misapplied CC&R section, the premature contractor visit, the HOA-funded work order on private property, the Facebook post naming participants, the community email with the wrong statutory citation sent under official letterhead. All of it documented, all of it time-stamped, all of it, in the attorney's assessment, essentially indefensible. Then the attorney apparently asked whether anyone on the board had sent a written warning to the homeowner prior to the cleanup. There was a silence. Then Diane, according to Patricia's contact, said that she had received a vague communication from me, but that it hadn't constituted a formal legal notice. The attorney asked to see it. She showed him the 6-word email. "You should stop here. I'm serious." The attorney looked at it for a moment. Then he asked when it was sent relative to the cleanup date. 4 days prior, Diane told him. Another silence. I wasn't in that room. I don't know exactly what was said next, but I know what happened immediately after the meeting, because Diane called me at 9:47 p.m. I still have the call log, and told me, in a voice stripped of every trace of the authority she'd carried since June, that the board was prepared to discuss a resolution. I told her I appreciated the call. I told her I'd be happy to discuss a resolution at the next regularly scheduled board meeting, which was open to all homeowners, and that I'd be bringing my documentation. She asked if we could handle it privately instead. I told her I didn't think that would be appropriate at this stage. There was a long pause on the line. I listened to it. I didn't fill it. Then she said she understood and ended the call. I sat in the kitchen for a while after that. Not triumphant, not relieved, just quiet. The way things get quiet when a process that has been moving for a long time finally reaches the point where the outcome is no longer in doubt, and all that's left is the formal acknowledgement of what everyone already knows. What is the loneliest moment for someone who built their power on the assumption that no one was paying attention? The moment they realize someone was. Or the moment they have to ask that person for mercy. I want to tell you what this was actually about. Not the permit, not the violation notices, not even the fence. It was about the herb beds. I know how that sounds, but stay with me. My wife Claire passed away 3 years ago, ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. She was 51. We had planned to retire together, to find a place with good soil and enough sun, to build the kind of garden she'd been drawing in notebooks since before I knew her. Raised beds, native plantings, a proper kitchen garden with rosemary and parsley, and the particular variety of basil she grew from seed every spring because she said the store-bought kind never smelled right. We found this lot together. She picked it specifically for the southern exposure and the 180-foot fence line. She said it was exactly enough room. She died 8 months before we were supposed to move in. I moved in anyway. I built the raised beds anyway. I planted the rosemary and the parsley and the basil from seed every spring, the variety she liked, because the store-bought kind never smells right. I built the native plant barrier along the fence line because it was what we had planned and because doing the things we planned together is the only way I know to keep the shape of a life that ended too soon. Biscuit, the golden retriever, destroyed the rosemary bed 3 times. I rebuilt it 3 times. I said nothing about what it meant each time I replanted it, because there's no version of that conversation with a neighbor that doesn't make you sound like you've come unhinged. When Diane's cleanup crew pulled up 2 seasons of native plantings along that fence line, plantings Claire had helped me choose from a native species guide she'd bookmarked on her laptop and never deleted, I stood on the back porch and felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. Not grief, something colder than grief. The specific anger of watching someone casually destroy something irreplaceable because they were too arrogant to read a document posted in plain sight. I didn't go outside. I topped off my coffee, and I thought, you have no idea what you just did, or who you just did it to. That's when I stopped being patient for strategic reasons and started being patient for a different reason entirely, because I wanted every single consequence to land exactly where it belonged. The regularly scheduled board meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the Lakewood Ranch Community Center, the same room where Diane had run 18 months of meetings without meaningful opposition, the same folding chairs, the same projector screen, the same water pitchers on the table at the front. 43 homeowners showed up. I know because I counted. Normal attendance for a board meeting in this community was 8 to 12. Word had gotten around, the way it does in a neighborhood where people talk, that something was going to happen. I sat in the 3rd row. Patricia Okafor sat beside me. I had a manila folder on my lap. Patricia had hers. Diane opened the meeting at 7 p.m. She looked like someone who hadn't slept well in 2 weeks, which, given the rash treatment and the attorney's visit and the phone call she'd made to me at 9:47 p.m., was probably accurate. Chad was not present. His seat at the board table was empty. Robert Tillman sat at the far end of the table and looked at the water pitcher in front of him. Diane moved through the preliminary agenda items quickly. Minutes from the prior meeting, treasurer's report, landscape committee update. Her voice was steady, but her hands, I noticed, were not entirely still. When she reached new business, she paused. I stood up before she could speak. I told the room I had a matter to raise under homeowner open comment, and that I would appreciate the board's patience because the documentation was detailed. I said it the way I used to say it in municipal hearings, not aggressive, not apologetic, just clear. The voice of someone who has done this before and knows exactly how long it takes. Then I walked to the projector and plugged in the drive I'd brought. The first slide was simple, a timeline, 14 entries dated and sourced. I walked through each one. Chad Hollister's vinyl wall approval, April, 4 days, no aesthetic review, 3 guideline violations not applied. My cedar fence rejection, June, no cited guideline, no comparison to approved structures on record. My 17-page appeal, denied without recorded board vote, in violation of the CC&R's own appeal procedure requiring a documented majority decision. The violation notice, issued 11 days after the denial, citing a standard not present in the actual CC&Rs, targeting plantings that had existed unremarked for 22 months. I paused there and asked the room if anyone had questions about the timeline so far. Nobody spoke. The second slide was the permit. County seal, approval date, protection status, the specific language about HOA override authority. I noted that this document had been posted in a weatherproof sleeve at the northern corner of the planting bed prior to the cleanup. I showed the camera timestamp, 8/16/07, and the 11-second footage of Diane standing in front of that sleeve, close enough to read it before turning away and picking up the pruning shears. The room was very quiet. The third slide was the Facebook post. I read Diane's own words aloud. The cheerful caption, the before and after photos, the comment thread where she described the plants as dangerous invasive species. I then displayed the county environmental officer's written confirmation of what those plants actually were: indigenous species, legally protected, established under a valid state permit. I noted that the post had been voluntarily published to a neighborhood audience, that it named participants, and that it had been archived at 12:34 p.m. on the day of the cleanup. I showed the community email next. Section 7.4 cited against a private property as though it were a common area, 11 days before the notice period had elapsed. 3 procedural violations in a single sentence, sent under official HOA letterhead to every homeowner in the community. Then I showed the contractor work order, HOA letterhead, Diane's signature, my address, HOA maintenance fund as the billing source. I noted that this document authorized the use of association funds for work on private property without a court order, without the homeowner's consent, and before the notice period had expired. I paused again, looked at the room. 43 people, most of whom had never seen any of this, sitting in folding chairs under fluorescent lights, very still. Then I showed Patricia Okafor's documentation, her 2 violation notices, the fines she had paid, the dates and amounts, the absence of any corresponding enforcement action against comparable properties. I told the room that Patricia had provided her records voluntarily and that she had authorized me to present them. Patricia nodded once from the 3rd row. The final slide was the insurance carrier's letter. I read the relevant paragraph aloud. The carrier's formal recommendation that the board seek independent legal counsel before taking any further enforcement actions. I noted that this letter had been generated not by my complaint, but by the carrier's own review of the documentation I had submitted. Then I turned off the projector and looked at Diane. I said, "Every action documented in this presentation was taken by members of this board after receiving a written warning that further escalation would have consequences. The warning is in the record. The timestamp is in the record. The response to that warning, the contractor visit, the 2nd violation notice, the community email is in the record. What this community is looking at tonight is not a misunderstanding. It is a pattern documented across 18 months, conducted in the open, under the assumption that no one was paying close enough attention to connect the pieces." I picked up my folder. I told the room I was requesting 3 things: reversal of both violation notices with written confirmation that no fines had accrued, a full refund of all fines paid by Patricia Okafor and any other homeowners who could demonstrate comparable selective enforcement, and an independent financial audit of HOA expenditures for the preceding 24 months to be conducted by a firm with no prior relationship to the current board. Then I sat down. The silence lasted long enough that someone's chair creaked and it sounded loud. Diane resigned before the meeting adjourned. She didn't make a speech. She wrote her resignation on a piece of notepaper, passed it to Robert Tillman, and left through the side door while I was still in my seat. Chad had already submitted his in writing that afternoon. Patricia's contact told me later he'd done it after his attorney reviewed the insurance carrier's letter and strongly advised him to distance himself from the board before the audit commenced. Robert Tillman was named interim board president by acclamation. He looked at me across the room for a moment before the vote. I gave him a small nod. He nodded back. The cedar fence went up in October, traditional post and rail, stained warm brown, the color Claire had picked from a sample card she'd left folded inside the native species guide on her laptop. The installer finished on a Friday afternoon, and I stood in the backyard for a long time after he left, in the particular quiet of a late Texas autumn and looked at it. It was exactly what it was always supposed to be. The independent audit uncovered $34,000 in unauthorized HOA expenditures, contractor payments, vendor arrangements, and line items that didn't correspond to any approved budget allocation. That process moved into a separate legal track that I'll leave where it belongs, which is with the people whose job it is to handle it. I gave my documentation to the appropriate parties and stepped back. That's all I was ever going to do. Patricia Okafor received a full refund of her fines within 30 days of the board meeting. 3 other homeowners came forward after the meeting with their own violation histories. The interim board processed all of them. Robert Tillman ran that process carefully and thoroughly, and I revised my opinion of him accordingly. He had seen something on that Saturday morning, crouched down in my planting bed, and had raised it once. He hadn't been strong enough then. He was stronger when it mattered more. The native plant barrier stayed, fully permitted, county protected, professionally reinstalled by the same landscaping team that had done the original work at the HOA's expense, as part of the settlement agreement the interim board signed without objection. The Virginia creeper came back first, the way it always does. Then the cedar elm seedlings, slower, patient, the kind of plant that doesn't hurry because it doesn't need to. The wild Mustang grape along the southern end, threading through the post and rail fence the way Claire had imagined it would when she'd sketched the original design in the margin of a plant catalog 3 years ago. Biscuit has not been back in the herb beds. The fence takes care of that now. The floodlights still run until midnight on Chad's side, but Chad's house went on the market in January, and the lights are somebody else's problem now. I replanted the rosemary in November, the same variety, from seed, the way she taught me, started indoors in late September, and transplanted when the soil temperature was right. It's small still. It'll take another season to fully establish. That's fine. I'm not in a hurry. Some things are worth building slowly and protecting completely, and never letting anyone take from you twice. What would you do differently if you knew that every system, no matter how untouchable it seems, has someone inside it who spent 30 years learning exactly how it breaks? If you've dealt with an HOA that forgot who it actually works for, drop your city below. I read every single one.
But here's what this story was really about. It was never about a fence. It was never about native plants or vinyl walls or HOA procedures. It was about a man who had already lost the most important thing in his life, and who was not going to let anyone take what remained of it. That's the part Diane Farrell never saw. She saw a quiet neighbor who didn't fight back. She saw compliance, or what looked like compliance. She saw someone she could push, and push again, and push a third time without consequence. She had no idea she was pushing someone who had already survived the worst thing. That's why she lost. Not because Marcus was smarter than her, though he was. Not because the law was on his side, though it was. She lost because she made the oldest mistake that unchecked authority ever makes. She confused silence for weakness. She assumed that because no one had ever held her accountable, no one ever could. And so she stopped being careful. She stopped checking her own citations. She sent violation notices with no legal basis. She signed work orders with HOA funds for work on private property. She stood in front of a posted county permit for 11 seconds, on camera, and then pulled out her pruning shears anyway. And then she posted the photos herself, with her own name attached, smiling. That's what happens when a system goes too long without consequence. It doesn't just get careless. It gets proud of the wrong things. Marcus won because he understood something most people don't, that the most powerful thing you can do in a conflict with an institution is stay quieter than they expect, longer than they're comfortable with, and let them build the case against themselves. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He documented. He waited. He gave her every off-ramp, on record, so that when she refused each one, that refusal became part of the evidence. He won because he knew that patience isn't passive. It's a weapon. And in the right hands, in the right circumstances, it is absolutely devastating. But underneath all of that, underneath the permits and the camera timestamps and the 41 pages of documentation, there was a rosemary plant, replanted 3 times, started from seed the way his wife had taught him, sitting in a raised bed that two people had planned together, in a yard they had chosen together, for a life they never quite got to live. That's what was actually being protected. And that's the thing about quiet people who finally decide enough is enough. They're not fighting about the thing you can see. They're fighting for something you'll never fully understand, which means they will not stop. Not until it's done. Most of us have met some version of Diane Farrell. Maybe not in an HOA. Maybe at work, in a building, in a family, in a neighborhood. Someone who decided the rules apply to everyone except them. Someone who moved fast, moved loud, and had never once been checked. The question I keep thinking about is this. At what point would you have stopped documenting? And would you have had enough patience to wait until they handed you everything you needed? If stories like this one stay with you, stick around. There are more coming.